Ara was adjusting the gold-trimmed porcelain when she heard the word that carried a death sentence. She didn't flinch. She didn't let the silver tongs tremble. That was the first rule of the Dragon Room, the VVIP sanctuary perched on the 88th floor of the Underworld Tower, looking down on Seoul like a god's balcony. You learned early on that at this altitude, your face had to be as cold as the marble floors, even when your heart was hammering against your ribs. She set the banchan down at the side table, bowed exactly 15 degrees, and faded into the shadows. Then, she stepped toward the head of the table and listened. Now, before we go any further, I want you to look at that contract on the table. If you were standing there, realizing a powerful man was about to sign away his life's work because he trusted the wrong voice, what would you do? Would you keep pouring the tea and collect your paycheck, or would you risk a bullet to tell a tiger he's being walked into a cage? Drop a comment right now. Stay silent or speak up. Keep that answer in mind, because what Ara did next didn't just break the rules of the restaurant. It rewrote the hierarchy of the Seoul underworld. Table 1 was the only table in the room. 3 men, 1 conversation, and a leather-bound folder sitting between them like a claymore mine dressed in legal stationery. Ara had been handpicked for this shift because she was the ghost. 6 months she'd spent at the Gilded Cloud. 6 months of serving vintage whiskey that cost more than her father's remaining debts, smiling at men who looked through her like she was part of the furniture, and going home to a cramped semi-basement apartment where the only thing waiting for her was a stack of final notice, letters, and her father's fatting health. She was invisible by necessity. She needed this job to keep her family's head above water. But some betrayals are so jagged, some lies are so sharp, that even a ghost can't help but bleed. When the translator smiled and turned the Russian word for liquidation into the Korean word for legacy, Ara knew the pen was about to hit the paper, and she knew she couldn't let it happen. To most people, the Gilded Cloud is a monument to success, but to me, it is a cathedral of silence. Down in the streets of Seoul, people scream to be heard, but up here on the 88th floor, power is measured by how little you have to say. My job is to be the heir, essential, present, but entirely unnoticed. There is a certain zen to it, a rhythmic meditation in the way I glide across the silk carpets, my movements timed to the low hum of the air filtration system. I have mastered the art of the invisible tilt, the exact angle of the head that suggests subservience without inviting eye contact. When you are invisible, people treat you like a piece of furniture that happens to carry a tray of $4,000 cognac. They discuss offshore accounts, broken marriages, and corporate assassinations as if I am deaf. They forget that before my father's shipping company was gutted by his partners, I wasn't just a waitress. I was a girl who spent her nights obsessing over the structural beauty of Indo-European roots and the hidden phonetics of Slavic dialects. My degree in linguistics is framed in a box in my damp semi-basement apartment, a useless piece of paper that couldn't pay for my mother's medication. But tonight, my ears are my only weapon. As I moved toward the center of the Dragon Room, the air felt different, heavy like the pressure before a tectonic shift. I could feel the presence of the man at the head of the table even before I looked at him. Han Seung-kyu sat with a stillness that was terrifying. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his watch. He simply existed at the center of the room, a predator at rest. Beside him, Choi Min-yi was leaning in, his voice a honeyed stream of perfectly modulated syllables. Min-yi was good. His syntax was flawless, his posture respectful. To anyone else, he was a loyal bridge between two worlds. But as I refilled the crystal water glass, a single word drifted from the Russian investor's mouth. It was a harsh, guttural term for forfeiture. I waited for Min-yi to mirror it in Korean. Instead, he smiled, that smooth, ambitious smile, and translated it as investment protection. The lie felt like a physical weight in the room. My hand didn't shake as I moved the glass, but inside, the linguistics student was screaming. I looked at the boss's hand, his fingers hovering over a fountain pen that looked more like a dagger than a writing instrument. If I stayed silent, the silent tiger would be skinned alive by the very man he paid to speak for him. If I spoke, I was a waitress who had broken the sanctuary of the VVIP room. I took a breath, the scent of expensive tobacco and impending ruin filling my lungs. The zen was gone. The ghost was starting to wake up. The double doors of the dragon room didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. When Han Seung-kyu walked in, the very molecules in the room rearranged themselves to make space for him. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace that earned him the name, the Silent Taiga. Not because he was loud, but because you could feel the weight of his kill long before he struck. He didn't look at the breathtaking view of the Seoul skyline or the gold-leafed ceiling. His eyes, dark and unreadable as a deep-sea trench, were fixed solely on the business at hand. I stood by the sideboard, my hands clasped in a perfect, neutral position. To him, I was just another part of the expensive decor, a shadow in a black uniform. He sat at the head of the mahogany table, and the silence he brought with him was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the Buddha. It was the pressurized quiet of a bomb squad holding its breath. Then there was Choi Min-yi. If the boss was the mountain, Min-yi was the mist, shifting, elegant, and impossible to pin down. He took his seat at Seung-kyu's right hand with the practiced ease of a man who knew he was indispensable. His gray suit was tailored to a razor's edge, and his smile was a masterpiece of corporate charm. He leaned toward the boss, his voice a low, respectful murmur that sounded like silk sliding over glass. To anyone watching, Min-yi was the perfect instrument, the loyal bridge between the tiger and the Russian wolf sitting across from them. I watched Min-yi's eyes. They weren't fixed on the contract, nor were they reflecting the cold calculation of his employer. They were darting, just for a fraction of a second, toward the Russian investor's briefcase. It was a hunger I recognized, the look of a man who had spent too long standing in the shadow of a giant and was finally ready to step into the light, even if he had to set the giant on fire to do it. The Russian, Viktor Petrov, began to speak. His voice was like grinding stones, filling the room with the harsh, rhythmic cadence of his native tongue. I felt the old thrill of decoding a foreign frequency, my mind automatically stripping the sentences down to their grammatical skeletons. But as Min-yi began to relay the translation to the boss, the elegant bridge began to warp. The words coming out of the translator's mouth were polished, encouraging, and utterly false. The tiger sat motionless, his large, scarred hand resting near a fountain pen that cost more than my apartment. He was listening to a lie, wrapped in the voice of his most trusted ally, and the silence in the dragon room began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Viktor Petrov leaned forward, his icy eyes cutting through the haze of expensive cigar smoke. He spoke in a low, gravelly Russian that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. To the untrained ear, it was merely the aggressive cadence of a foreign businessman making a point. But to me, the words were as clear as a siren in a graveyard. Petrov wasn't talking about a partnership. He was talking about an acquisition. He used the term poglasheniai, a cold, clinical word for a hostile takeover. I stood by the sideboard, my hands occupied with the silver tongs as I prepared a fresh serving of kimchi for the center of the table. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I waited for Min-yi to relay the weight of that word to the boss. Min-yi didn't even blink. He adjusted his silk tie, leaning toward Han Seung-kyu with an expression of profound loyalty. Mr. Petrov is reiterating his commitment to a synergetic merger, boss, Min-yi murmured in Korean, his voice smooth and reassuring. He says this deal will ensure your legacy is protected by international law. It's exactly the security we discussed. It was a masterful performance. Min-yi wasn't just translating, he was laundering the truth. He was taking the jagged glass of Petrov's threats and melting them down into a sweet, swallowable syrup. Across the table, Petrov continued, his tone growing sharper. He began outlining the structural reorganization of the tiger's Seoul territories. He used the word ustupka, concession. He was demanding the boss hand over the keys to the southern ports. Again, Min-yi filtered the poison out. He's suggesting a joint management of the docks to increase efficiency, the translator whispered. I looked at Han Seung-kyu. The silent tiger sat perfectly still, his large hand resting near the contract, his face a mask of granite. He was a man who ruled through instinct and iron, but he was trapped in a linguistic cage. He was flying blind, and the man holding the controls was the one steering him toward the cliff. The air in the dragon room grew thin. I could see the subtle sheen of sweat on Minyi's upper lip, the only crack in his armor. He was playing a dangerous game, betting everything that a lowly waitress wouldn't know the difference between a murder and a massacre. He thought I was just a ghost in a black dress, a witness who couldn't understand the testimony. But as Petrov slid the gold pen across the table toward the boss, the silence in the room became deafening. The trap wasn't just set, it was closing. The gold-tipped fountain pen felt like a ticking clock as it hovered over the final page of the contract. Han Seung-kyu, the silent tiger, wasn't a man who rushed, but the pressure in the dragon room was reaching a breaking point. I moved in to clear the appetizer plates, my movements a blurred streak of black fabric and practiced grace. As I leaned over the mahogany surface, my eyes darted toward the dense block of text resting beneath the tiger's hand. Section 14, Subsection C. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest. There it was, buried under a mountain of legalese and translated into a Russian dialect specifically chosen for its ambiguity. The word was confiscatia. In a standard business setting, a sloppy translator might call it a transfer of assets. But I knew the roots of that word. I knew its history in the brutal restructuring of post-Soviet empires. It didn't mean transfer. It meant a total, irreversible seizure without compensation. It was a kill switch. If the boss signed this, he wasn't just entering a partnership. He was signing a confession of insolvency. The Russian would own the ports, the high-rises, and the very ground we stood on by sunrise. I glanced at Choi Min-yi. The translator was leaning back slightly now, his posture shedding the last remnants of his subservient mask. He thought the game was over. I saw it then, a flicker of a smirk, so faint it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to read the micro-expressions of the elite. It was the look of a man who had already spent the money he hadn't yet stolen. He looked at the tiger not as a master, but as a carcass. "The terms are exactly as we discussed, boss," Min-yi whispered, his voice dripping with a counterfeit sincerity that made my skin crawl. "A legacy for your family, a fortress for your empire." The tiger's grip tightened on the pen. He was a man of iron, but even iron can be melted if the heat is applied from the inside. He looked at Petrov, who remained as cold and unmoving as a Siberian winter, then back at the paper. The silence was so heavy I could hear the microscopic scratch of the pen's nib against the grain of the wood. I stood there, a ghost in a waitress uniform, holding a tray of empty shells. In that moment, the linguistics student and the servant collided. I knew the price of silence. I had watched my father lose everything because he believed in the honor of a handshake. If I walked away now, I was an accomplice to the murder of an empire. The pen descended. The nib touched the paper. A single drop of ink began to bloom like a dark, indelible stain. The nib of the pen was a hair's breadth from the signature line, a tiny point of gold poised to trigger a landslide. In the suffocating stillness of the dragon room, my vision blurred for a split second, and the mahogany table was replaced by the scarred oak desk of my father's old office. I could still smell the stale coffee and the ozone of a failing air conditioner. I saw his hand, the same steady, honest hand, trembling as he signed a document he couldn't fully decode, trusting a partner who had been his best friend since childhood. "It's for the family, Ara," he had whispered that night, his face gray with exhaustion. A new beginning. It hadn't been a beginning. It had been an eviction notice served with a smile. My father had spent his life building a legacy with his sweat, only to have it liquidated by a man who spoke the language of greed while wearing the mask of loyalty. The memory tasted like copper in my mouth. I had spent years running from that shadow, hiding in the anonymity of service, convincing myself that being invisible was the only way to be safe. I had told myself that my voice was a liability, a reminder of a status I no longer possessed. But standing here, watching history prepare to repeat itself in a room draped in silk and blood, the safety of my silence felt like a coward's shroud. If I let Han Seung-kyu sign that paper, I wasn't just a waitress. I was the ghost of my father's betrayal. I looked at the back of the tiger's neck. He was a man of violence, a man whose very name made the city tremble, but in this moment, he was as vulnerable as my father had been. He was a lion being led into a pit by a fox. Beside him, Minyi's eyes were fixed on the pen, his breathing shallow and greedy. He was so close to his triumph that he had forgotten to watch the furniture. He had forgotten that the woman clearing the dregs of his tea had a mind that functioned like a decryption machine. My fingers tightened around the edge of my serving tray. To speak was to invite a storm that could level my entire life. The gilded cloud would fire me before my shift ended. Minyi's associates would ensure I never found work in Seoul again if they even let me leave the building. My family needed the pittance I earned here. They needed me alive. But then I looked at the ink blooming on the page, and I realized some debts can't be paid in cash. I couldn't save my father, but I could stop the lie. I shifted my weight, the zen of the servant finally shattering. The invisible woman was about to make a very loud noise. The tip of the gold nib was a fraction of a second from completing the first curve of the tiger's name. The air in the dragon room felt brittle, like frozen glass waiting for the hammer. My father's face flashed in my mind one last time, the look of a man who realized he had been gutted only after the blood started to pool. I wouldn't let it happen again. Not tonight, not on my watch. I moved. It wasn't a desperate lung, it was a fluid, professional correction. As I reached for the half-empty wine glass near Han Seung-kayu's elbow, I allowed my wrist to falter, just a millimeter. The stem tipped. A splash of deep, garnet-red Cabernet bloomed across the white tablecloth, a jagged stain racing toward the edge of the contract. "Oh, my deepest apologies, sir," I gasped, my voice a perfect pitch of practiced, girlish panic. Minyi's head snapped toward me, his smirk instantly replaced by a mask of lethal annoyance. "You clumsy!" he started to bark, but I was already leaning in, a linen napkin clutched in my hand, my body shielding the boss from the translator's line of sight. The silent tiger didn't move. He didn't even flinch at the wet slap of the wine. He simply looked at me, his dark eyes narrowing into twin obsidian blades. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer gravitational pull of a man who had survived 1,000 betrayals. As I pressed the napkin onto the table, my hand brushed against the sleeve of his tailored suit. I leaned closer, my lips inches from the shell of his ear, the scent of expensive tobacco and iron filling my senses. My voice was a ghost's breath, sharp, precise, and stripped of its servant's lilt. "Don't sign," I whispered, the words cutting through the tension like a razor. "The Russian said seizure. Your man said success. You are being liquidated, not invested in." I pulled back instantly, my eyes dropping to the floor in a display of profound shame. "I am so sorry, boss. I will bring a fresh cloth immediately." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of a trap. It was the silence of a predator who had just realized there was a snake in the grass. Han Seung-kayu didn't look at the wine. He didn't look at the contract. He slowly turned his head to look at Choi Min-yi. The translator was still frozen, his mouth half open, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. He hadn't heard what I said, but he could feel the temperature in the room drop 40 degrees. The pen in the tiger's hand remained perfectly still, the ink drying on the page, the signature unfinished. I stepped back into the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst through the silk of my uniform. The invisible woman had spoken, and the tiger was finally awake. Han Seung-kayu didn't yell. He didn't flip the table or reach for the weapon I knew was holstered beneath his charcoal blazer. Instead, he set the gold pen down with a click that sounded like a bone breaking in the silence. He leaned back, his obsidian eyes drifting from the wine-stained contract to the man at his right hand. "Min-yi," the boss murmured. His voice was a low, melodic rumble, the sound of a landslide still miles away. "The Russians spoke of the southern ports just now. Remind me, what was the term he used for our future collaboration?" Min-yi's composure didn't shatter all at once. It eroded. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, disappearing into the collar of his expensive suit. He glanced at Petrov, who sat like a gargoyle, sensing the shift in the air but unable to bridge the linguistic gap. He used the term for strategic alliance, boss," Min-yi stammered, his silver tongue suddenly heavy with lead. "A partnership of equals, just as we discussed in the preliminary briefs." The tiger tilted his head, a slow, predatory movement. Is that so? Because I could have sworn I heard a harder sound, something closer to seizure. The blood drained from Minyi's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the contract, then at the boss, and finally his gaze flickered toward me, the waitress standing in the shadows with a tray of soiled linen. For a second, his eyes flared with a murderous realization. He knew. Boss, the girl. She's just a servant, she doesn't know. I didn't ask about the girl, Seung interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. I asked about the truth. The tension snapped. Minyi's hand darted toward his waistband, his desperation overriding his intellect. Across the table, Petrov's hand moved toward the briefcase. It was the start of a massacre, a room full of powerful men about to paint the gold-leafed walls red. Sir, I gasped, stepping forward with the heavy silver wine chiller. I didn't wait for permission. I tripped forward, swinging the weighted bucket with every ounce of my strength. It slammed into the edge of the mahogany table, sent ice and freezing water cascading directly into Minyi's lap and over the Russian's briefcase. The shock of the freezing water broke the lethal rhythm. Minyi flinched, his hand tangling in his wet coat, while Petrov jumped back to save his documents. The split-second distraction was all the tiger needed. Seung-kai's hand clamped onto Minyi's throat before the translator could draw his breath. The boss didn't even stand up. He simply squeezed, his knuckles turning white as he leaned in close to the traitor's ear. You thought I was deaf, the tiger whispered, but it seems the gilded cloud has much better ears than I gave it credit for. He turned his gaze toward me. And for the first time, he didn't look through me. He looked at me. The aftermath of the accident was a blur of sterile anger and cold rain. Within 10 minutes, Seo Jaihai, the restaurant manager, had cornered me in the locker room. Her face was a mask of professional fury, her voice a sharp hiss that cut deeper than any blade. You ruined a $1 billion deal, she spat, her eyes darting toward the dragon room as if the ghost of the confrontation still haunted the air. I don't care what you heard or what you thought you were doing. You are a waitress, Ara. Your only job was to be invisible, and you failed. She didn't let me explain. She didn't want to hear about the linguistic traps or the tiger's life. She simply handed me a final envelope of cash, docked for the damaged tablecloth, and pointed toward the service exit. The alleyway behind the gilded cloud was a narrow canyon of wet concrete and overflowing trash bins, miles away from the opulence of the 88th floor. The rain was a cold, needles and pins drizzle that soaked through my thin coat in seconds. I clutched my bag, my mind already calculating how many weeks this meager pay would last against my mother's hospital bills. I had saved an empire, but I couldn't even save my own shift. I hadn't made it 10 yards toward the subway entrance when the shadows at the end of the alley detached themselves from the brickwork. 3 men. They didn't wear the tailored suits of the VVIP room, but they had the same predatory stillness I had seen in the tiger's eyes. In the center stood one of Minyi's associates, a man I recognized from the lobby, the kind of man who handled the dirty work while Minyi played the diplomat. You have a very expensive mouth, little girl, he said, the click of a folding knife echoing off the damp walls. Minyi is currently being questioned by the boss, and he's very upset that his retirement plan was ruined by a girl who carries plates. I backed away, my heels catching on the uneven pavement. The linguistics student in me noted the dialect, Gyeongsang, rough and aggressive. The survivalist in me noted the distance to the main street. It was too far. I had stepped out of the shadows to save a monster, and now the shadows were coming to claim their due. The man stepped into the light of a flickering street lamp, the blade gleaming. The boss might be busy with the traitor, but we have plenty of time for the witness. I felt the cold brick of the building press against my spine. I had traded my invisibility for the truth, and now the price was being collected in the dark. The man with the blade was a step away when the alleyway exploded into a blinding glare of white light. 2 black sedans roared around the corner, their tires screaming against the wet asphalt as they boxed us in. The thugs froze, shielding their eyes, but the men who stepped out of the cars didn't wait for them to adjust. Kwon Tae-sik, the boss's enforcer, moved with the efficiency of a machine. He didn't say a word as he disarmed the man with the knife in one fluid motion, the sound of breaking bone muffled by the rain. Within seconds, Minyi's associates were pinned against the brickwork, their bravado evaporated. T-Sick didn't spare them a second glance. He walked toward me, his muscular frame casting a shadow that swallowed mine. "The boss doesn't like leaving his debts unpaid," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He gestured toward the open door of the lead sedan. "And he has a very long memory." I didn't ask where we were going. I knew that the world I had inhabited, the world of service entrances and hospital bills, was gone. The car glided through the neon-soaked streets of Seoul, eventually pulling into the underground garage of a fortress-like estate in Gangnam. When the door opened, I was led into a study filled with the scent of old paper and expensive scotch. Han Seung-kyu sat behind a desk of dark oak, the wine-stained contract from the restaurant sitting in the center of the blotter like a trophy. He looked up as I entered. The terrifying pressure was still there, but the lethal edge was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp curiosity. "Your manager called you a waitress," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. It wasn't a menu. It was my university transcript, my linguistics certifications, and a full dossier on my father's downfall. But a waitress doesn't recognize a Russian liquidation clause from 10 feet away. A waitress doesn't risk a blade to save a man she's never met. He stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. "Minyi is gone. I find myself in need of a voice I can trust, one that doesn't filter the truth to suit its own hunger." He turned back to me, his silhouette framed by the lights of Seoul. "You spent 6 months being invisible, Ara. How would you like to be the most heard woman in this city?" He held out a hand. It wasn't an offer of a job. It was an invitation into the inner circle of the tiger. I looked at his hand, then at the city below, and realized that my father's legacy wasn't in the company he lost. It was in the language he taught me to speak. I took his hand. The ghost was finally gone. The voice had arrived.